Well, howdy there, folks. James, Political Friar, coming to you again. Got the London School of Economics hat on today, and so we're going to do another international affairs update. This is going to be a little bit like the Israeli update that I published earlier, and that I'm going to catch us up from where we left off before I took my little break in doing videos to go back to work. So, when we left off, the Ukrainians had just launched an invasion of Russia. They had stormed across their northern border into the Kursk Oblast and taken some hundreds of square miles of Russian territory. Now, there's no significant settlements in the territory that they took, and there's no significant strategic objectives in the territory they took, except for the fact that it is Russian territory. It is militarily insignificant. The fact that it is Russian territory, though, is quite significant. So let's just do a little bit of analysis about why the Ukrainians appeared to have chosen to launch this offensive instead of using those same units in the defense. See, over the course of the summer, the Russians have conducted a truly ghastly, grinding offensive against Ukraine, focused on the very southeastern tip of the front. Now, this was where Vuhledar and Adivka were fortress towns that had actually been in Ukrainian hands and fighting the Russians in those places since 2014. Well, 10 years later, the Russians, at incredible cost, were able to overcome Ukrainian defenses, but it wasn't that significant. The Ukrainians simply fell back and kept killing Russians. Now, there was another axis of advance in the north of Ukraine, coming south towards Kharkiv, that the Russians attempted, and the Ukrainians were able to contain that incursion and stabilize the front. And at great expense, the Russians gained a very small amount of Ukrainian territory there in the north and didn't come anywhere close to Kharkiv. Kharkiv offensive, the one coming from Russia south into Ukraine towards Ukraine's second largest city, was designed to bring Russian forces within artillery range of the big city to allow for terror bombing, frankly. And the Ukrainians have to be said to have won a victory there. They lost a little bit of territory, but strategically and operationally, they succeeded in holding the Russians away from their objectives. The final axis of advance that the Russians attempted was in the mid-center towards Krenki and a line of settlements in eastern Ukraine, sort of the far western part of what is Donetsk province, and that was basically just a ramming the Russian head into the Ukrainian wall. So from Krenki down to Chasiv Yar, the Russians have attempted to advance and have not had success. This has gone for months, costing tens and tens of thousands of Russian lives and some 10,000 Ukrainian lives. The guess on the Ukrainian versus Russian casualties is usually around 3-1. It is, there are 3 Russian casualties for each 1 Ukrainian casualty. And when you're looking at the actual territory and the strategic significance of the entire war, it's not different. It's not significantly different than this time last year. Yes, the Russians have gained some territory. Yes, the Ukrainians invaded Kursk, and that last is politically potentially important because it's Russian territory, but as far as from a military perspective, it's not. The Ukrainians didn't capture anything that the Russians would miss. And so you've now got a real war of attrition. Think World War I style. Think, frankly, Civil War style. Wars of attrition where both sides have the technology and the will to defend and attack each other as long as their material and political will is maintained. And there's very little reason to think that either Ukraine or Russia will have any trouble maintaining the material or political ability to continue the war, at least through really through next year. Now, next summer may be an interesting time to pop our heads up, just because the weather will, be okay for offensive operations again. But I believe, based off of what is available in open source, and frankly, a lot of it is because of the way that the economic reporting, even in Russia, is done, that the Russians will be able to maintain their current force posture through the end of next year in 2025. And with the amount of support and supplies that the Ukrainians have been given by the West already, and their new mobilization law, which let them access significantly greater amounts of manpower, and so too with the Ukrainians. So what we saw after the front stabilized in the fall is continued grinding operations along the entire front with no significant changes. And that's all you're going to see this winter, I suspect. Now, in Eastern Europe, as we've discussed in previous videos, there are two money seasons, and these are traditionally the seasons for making peace. And we have just entered the first. The rain has started to fall in Ukraine, and that's going to make offensive operations for Russia pretty difficult, if not impossible. They would be possible if you had a area with lots of pavement. For example, the Bakhmut battle happened over the winter, but it happened in a city, not out in the country. Out in the country, you can't drive a tank across the wheat field. It's stuck. There's too much mud. You're stuck on the roads. And when you're stuck on the roads, you're just a big fat target to all of the Ukrainian artillery and drones, or vice versa, the Russian artillery and drones. And so it is a time when the military operations are going to slow to a trickle. They'll never stop. You'll still have infantry assaults. You'll still have raids. You'll still have this and that. But it is going to slow down dramatically. And that's one of the reasons why Vladimir Zelensky called his peace summit last month, and he revealed his victory plan, because it is effectively an entree into negotiations. The peace plan and the victory summit didn't actually give us anything new, though. The Ukrainian position is that they must have their territory back, and they must have security guarantees. One element that came through this month from Zelensky that I found shockingly honest is that he suggested that Ukraine is only going to be safe under two circumstances. One, that it gets a security guarantee akin to Article 5 in NATO. That's the mutual defense article under NATO. So if Russia were to attack Ukraine again, the United States would be obliged to defend Ukraine directly, along with the rest of NATO. The other way that Ukraine could become secure is the way that North Korea is secure, and it's the way that China is secure, and it's the way that Russia is secure. It's to have nuclear weapons. Ukraine can create nuclear weapons. Ukraine has had nuclear weapons in the past. The Ukrainians have the technology, they have the industrial base, they have the nuclear reactors, they could make them. I suspect they are, actually. So if Ukraine wants to be secure, well, it either needs to have a security guarantee with a nuclear umbrella, or it needs to create its own nuclear deterrent. And Zelensky said that out loud. And we kind of knew that, but he said it out loud, which was an interesting escalation to the political battle that is just now being joined. See, it's peacemaking time in Eastern Europe, if they're going to. I don't think there's any real appetite for it, though. I think both sides in this war of attrition calculate that they have a path to victory, and they have the means to continue to pursue it. And until one of those two things is cut off, wars like this don't end. The Allies and the Central Powers in World War I tried to make peace every year in the winter, and they never were successful because they had other options. They still could fight. And as long as a big state can keep fighting, well, all of the incentives say that they should, and they will. So the next phase of this war will go through the fall where it'll be slow. There'll be a period in January, late December, January, where the ground will freeze over and provide a small window for offensive operations. That window I don't expect is going to yield much. As the summer came to a close, see, both sides hit a point of maximum effort. The Russians were truly hoping to get to a city in Donetsk called Pokrovsk, which is a transportation hub. It's not much of a strategic objective, but it's more than anything else the Russians have got since 2022. And they didn't get there, but they put a lot into it, and they are almost certainly in need of reconstituting themselves. As part of the Russian reconstitution, apparently, they're inviting North Korean military to come and help them. And it's unclear whether this is going to be infantry fighting on the front lines or whether it's just going to be support troops or whatever. But it is clear that the North Koreans are about to become active participants in the war. That is to say, you will have 3 countries in this war now: Russia, Ukraine, and North Korea. This is something of an escalation, and it's particularly a big political escalation. Once the Russians are bringing their allies in, North Korea, that might open the door to Ukraine asking its allies to be more actively involved. I have no idea what, say, Poland would say if the Ukrainians suggested that Poland should match North Korea in its contribution. I can say that Polish troops fighting on Ukrainian soil against Russians would not, capital N, not trigger NATO involvement. The Article 5, it talks about an attack on the sovereign territory of the member. It is not applicable for expeditionary forces. So when Iran attacked American soldiers in Iraq, it did not trigger Article 5 and make all of NATO come down on Iran. So it's not inconceivable that you could see some type of strategic tit for tat for this North Korean intervention. I just don't know. And it'll probably depend a lot on how the North Korean troops are employed and how effective they are. They will potentially be employed in any kind of way, and they're not going to be effective at all. The North Koreans' equipment is trash. They certainly have no actual combat experience, and they're fighting literally the best, most bloodied army in the world in the Ukrainians. So I don't expect it to have much of an effect on the actual front lines, but it could have a political effect. After this fall comes, we'll have that winter period of very short offensive operations, and then another period in the spring. Now, if there is going to be peace this next year, it'll happen sometime before May. And that is going to be extremely dependent on the U.S. presidential election. Were Donald Trump to be elected, I think you could expect him to sell Ukraine out. I think you can expect him to negotiate directly with the Russians the same way he negotiated directly with the Taliban, and just like he sold out the Afghans, he would sell out Ukraine, and he'd say that justify it for all kinds of reasons. But the end result there would be Russia wins, Ukraine loses, and in effect, the United States loses. And surrender is a option that J.D. Vance is absolutely in favor of, and I believe Donald Trump would do that too. There are reasons. We aren't going to get into them in this video. We're just telling you what is going to happen. Now, if Harris wins the election, I suspect that we will have more of the same. A general open-ended, support for Ukraine. There might not be a lot more money coming Ukraine's way from the United States, but Ukraine doesn't need it as much as it did last year. The Europeans, in particular, are stepping up and giving Ukraine a lot more funding, and Ukraine's finding ways to support itself domestically in measures that it didn't have in place previously. So I don't imagine that the United States backing off of its monetary act of support is going to change too much of this calculation, in particular because the Russian economy is on its way for a real reckoning. the inflation in the United States that caused such consternation topped out at 8%. Well, it's already over 12% in Russia and getting worse. Russia's foreign currency reserves will be exhausted by the middle of next year. And at that point, they're basically trading. They're on barter terms, oil for whatever they can get. They're not going to be able to actually buy stuff. And that means no microprocessors, no sophisticated weapons, and they're going to go kind of back into a 1950s era of technology that their own industrial base can support. The Ukrainians won't have that problem. So the sophistication of the Ukrainian army is going to degrade much slower than the sophistication of the Russian army. And the Russians also appear to have a manpower problem. They are unwilling to do another mobilization of Russian men because of the political consequences. And so by the end of 2025, Russia will have shot its bolt. It may very well be able to defend the territory it's taken, but its offensive ability to further its gains in Ukraine will be shot. It'll also be right on the verge of probably what could be well described as an economic depression. There won't be any money to continue to support the high-paying jobs that the Russians currently enjoy in the defense industry. The money won't be worth anything because there won't be any foreign reserves behind it. It'll just become paper. And hyperinflation is a really good way to end a war. It is what started the Germans down, recognizing that they couldn't continue fighting in 1918. I don't think Ukraine will have that problem. Ukraine's got enough backers in Europe to avoid it. So, that is to say, as long as the West and the United States don't want to lose, they don't have to. If they want Russia to lose, well, they can have Russia lose. I believe that there are elements within the Republican Party who, for reasons, some of them perfectly fine, legitimate, and maybe some of them a little odd, I think that there are elements in the Republican Party who want the West to lose. They want the West to lose because they fundamentally disapprove of how the West's certain civilization has developed, and they want to develop differently. I think that's where J.D. Vance is coming from. J.D. Vance is a true capital C conservative. He thinks that there is a role for the family and the church and all of those big capital C conservative institutions in Western society, and he sees the intervention in any Western institutions that aren't derivative of those things as less ideal. And so if they can fail or be discredited, well, that actually furthers his objectives towards how he thinks the United States ought to be. Donald Trump is much more transactional than that. I honestly think Donald Trump has a deep emotional aversion to war. He doesn't like it. And so I think he's more interested in selling the Ukrainians out and surrendering for kind of emotional, personal reasons than any kind of clearly thought out ideological sense of things. So either way, the Ukrainians' fate is going to not turn on the election because I think Ukraine can continue to hold out even if Donald Trump attempts to sell them out. But it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt. And it's going to be interesting to see what Europe does. If Donald Trump tries to surrender for Ukraine, will Europe step up and say, no, Ukraine, we got you, buddy? Because in the end, the United States can't surrender for Ukraine. If the Ukrainians want to continue to fight without the United States support, well, we can't stop them. And the Ukrainians may eventually not need the United States' support. That would be a huge defeat. Either way, for the United States, we either lose, Ukraine loses and Russia wins, or if Ukraine manages to hold out without us, we lose too. The United States becomes less relevant in the world affairs. And that's something that J.D. Vance would say, yeah, no, that's a good thing. The United States doesn't want to be relevant in world affairs, but that will make us less secure overall. It turns out that when you are in charge of stuff, you can keep the wolves from being born. But once the United States stops participating, well, you're going to get new poles of power developing. And there's no reason to believe that Europe is always going to be on America's side. Not always. And if we force Europe to develop into an independent power pole by basically not giving them the security that they have come to rely on, well, that could result in Europe deciding that they need to make an accommodation with some other powers like, China. And it could result in the United States finding itself isolated not by choice, but by strategy. And that makes us all much less secure. Anyway, just a thought. I know this went a little long, but it's been a while, and I wanted to catch us up pretty much to modern times on this topic because, frankly, this is one of the topics that people don't watch as often. I'll have another video about Israel coming soon and some more U.S. politics stuff on the way. But until then, give me a like, hit that subscribe button, leave a comment in the comments down below. Tell me how wrong I am, and just know that I really appreciate you. Thanks.